I was introduced to this crawfish imitation by Darren Lee of Opelousas, Louisiana. And it's the May's full motion crawfish, and it was created by Ontario based guides Steve May and Ken Collins for smallmouth bass. But it should work just as well for our largemouth and down in the marsh for redfish. The hook I'm going to use for this pattern is the Gamakatsu 60-degree jig hook in size 1, but this fly can be tied down to about a size 6 as well. And I'm using UTC 140 denier in the burnt orange color, which matches this crawfish quite well. And I start my thread just back of the 60-degree bend and wrap back on the hook and create a thread base of about 1/4 of an inch. And then bring the thread back to about the middle and trim off that tag end. To add a little weight, I'm going to tie in Hareline's Brass Eyes in size medium, and these are black. And to change the sink rate of this fly, you can use various eyes from bead chain to lead, depending on how deep you want the fly to go. To tie in the barbell eyes, I hold those eyes at a slight diagonal over the hook shank and take a couple of loose wraps, just tight enough to hold the eyes to the top of the hook. And then I reach around to the other side and take diagonal wraps in the other direction. And then I can start making tighter diagonal wraps in each direction. And after making a half dozen or so wraps, I like to make what's called a stirrup wrap, where I go over the top of one side of the eye and under the hook, and then over the top of the other side of the eye and back under the hook. So over the top, under, over the top, under, over the top, under, over the top, under. And after 5 or 6 of those, I bring the thread on top of the hook shank and under the eye and make some cinch wraps to really secure those eyes to the hook shank. And then I move my thread back to the rear of the hook, and I want to wrap back into the bend about halfway between the barb and the rear of the hook, and then leave my thread hanging just at the point of the hook. For the antenna of the crawfish, I'm going to use natural ringneck pheasant tail feathers, and I strip off about a dozen or so of those from the feather and line up the tips roughly and then trim those little fuzzies off the end because they will hang on the thread. Now we don't want our antenna to be all clumped up together, so we want some separation of those fibers. So using my thumbnail and fingernail, I just kind of strip along the feather fibers, which gives us a little bit of curl to those and kind of helps separate them a bit and make them look more like antenna. And we want the antenna to be about as long as the hook shank, maybe a little bit longer. And so I'll measure that and then transfer that measurement back to the rear of the hook shank. And then giving my bobbin a little counterclockwise twist, I bind down the ends of those feathers and then bind it down all the way back into the bend of the hook, right to where my previous thread base ends. And then I bring my thread back to the hook point. And then I want to spread those out a little bit. They're kind of clumped together, so I just pick those fibers apart and spread them out a bit to help separate those antennae. Our next material is black Antron yarn, and this forms more of the head of the anatomy of the crawfish. And I want this piece to be about as long as the hook shank and extend about 2/3 of the length of those antennae, or maybe just a little less. And this is a little long, so I'm going to trim that a bit shorter so it'll match up with that previous wrap, and then bind down the end of that antron and take thread wraps all the way back again to that rear of that thread base. And then bring my thread back up and wrap back to about the hook point and leave my thread hanging there. For eyes on the head end of our crawfish, I'm going to use Stonefo's plastic eyes, and these come in a pack of 20 with 10 large and 10 small eyes. And they're really nice and easy to tie down because of this squared shaft on them. So I'll line them up where the Y on those eyes is about even with the back of my thread wraps. And I want to make sure that those eyes extend past the bend of the hook and that that Y is about even right there with the end of my thread wraps. And so I'll make a few wraps, wrap back to that back of my, my thread base again, and then wrap forward to about the hook point. And to imitate the legs on our crawfish, we use cross-cut rabbit strips, and these cross-cut strips are great because the hair is directional on the cross-cut, and you can see it leaning off to the left. And since we want that to go toward the back of our hook, we want to make sure that we tie it in lined up in that direction. I've stripped about a ½ inch of the fur off to create my tie-in point, and I tie it in just on top of the hook at my previous tie-in points for the other materials. But in this case, I'm not wrapping back all the way to the bend of the hook. I'm wrapping only about halfway. And I'm leaving about an 1/8 to a ¼ inch of that bare skin because I'm going to palmer this over, and that bare skin will help that fur lay down better as I palmer it forward on the hook shank. So take a few wraps back forward to bind everything down, and then leave my thread hanging at about the hook point. And to keep this rabbit out of the way, I just use a little hair clip to clip it to the back of my vise. To form the shell of the crawfish, I use Crawdad Orange Furry Foam. And I cut a strip of this about a hook gap in width. And that hook gap on this #1 hook is about a ½ inch wide. And I cut the strip, about an inch longer than the hook shaft itself. And then on one end of it, I cut a fairly short point for a tie-in point. And then rotate my hook so it's hook point up, and then move my thread back to that rear of my previous thread wraps. And notice I'm still not going over all of that rabbit where it's tied down. And to tie in our foam, I hold the base of that point right over the thread and take a couple of really loose wraps right at the base of that, and then begin to cinch it down, trying to keep it on top of the hook shank. And it's not critical if that point rotates off to the side, but do your best to keep it on top of the hook shank, and then take a few wraps just to bind just that point section down. And wrap it back to that original tie-in point for the foam. And then pull the foam forward to check to make sure it's far enough back, because that forms the head or the beginning part of the body of our fly. And advance our thread back to the hook point area. And then I like to tuck this foam out of the way, kind of up in the hook gap, and then just pierce it on the hook point just to kind of hold it out of the way. And then I rotate my hook back to the normal orientation. For the claws of our crawfish, we're going to use silly legs, and here these are barred and speckle crazy legs in orange, which is a great match for this crawfish color. And I peel off 5 strands of this, and if you can leave those strands attached to that little material that holds them together at the ends, it will make it much, much easier to tie these in. And so I begin by wrapping these around the hook shank and keeping those ends lined up. I like to put a finger between the 2 sides to separate the 2 sides of the legs so I can hold them down on each side of the hook. And so I get that finger in there, and then I stretch them back and begin binding them down toward the rear of the hook. And I bind them down to about the back tie-in point of my foam. And then bring my thread back to just behind the dumbbell eyes and let it hang there. Now pull those legs forward, and keeping them separated on each side of the hook shank, I unclip my rabbit, and I want to take 1 wrap behind the legs. So I go behind the legs, and you have to kind of maneuver them around your legs here. So I make 1 complete wrap behind the legs, right up against the legs, and this helps them stand straight out from the hook shank. And then I go under the hook shank and then come in front of the legs, and then take a wrap just against the legs in the front, and that will help push them to the rear just a little bit. And then I begin to make somewhat overlapping wraps, just barely overlapping wraps forward to just behind the dumbbell eye, making sure I keep those fibers swept back as I'm palmering the rabbit forward. Now when I get just behind the dumbbell eyes, I'll take a couple of wraps behind the rabbit, over the rabbit, and then in front. And then reach in and trim off that tag end of the rabbit fur. And then I sweep those fibers back and wrap back over that rabbit fur, not all the way back, but I want to leave, an eighth of an inch or so gap there right in front of the hook point, and then wrap forward. And then leave my thread just behind the dumbbell eyes. Now this body will be covered with a dubbing, but I'm going to trim some of those fuzzies off. For the dubbed underbody, we're using Hareline Hairy Ice Dub in brown, which is a great blend of sparkle and hare's fur dubbing. And I want to build a dubbing noodle that's about 4 to 5 inches long. And even though this is a fairly long and fairly large noodle, we don't want to add too much dubbing at any one time because the synthetic blend dubbing will clump up on our dubbing noodle if we try to add too much at one time. So I build my noodle that this one's about 5 inches long, and then I begin wrapping just behind the barbell eyes. Now I'm a little close to my camera here, so I'm having to put some slack in the thread, which you don't normally do, but I'm a little close to my camera. And then make touching wraps back over that tied down underbody of the fur, all the way back against the rabbit fur. And leave that thread hanging just at the back of the rabbit fur. And the body has a slight taper, a little bit larger in the back part of the body. Now to tie in our furry foam, we rotate our hook, so it's again hook point up. And I sweep those rabbit fibers back to where I try to have roughly equal amounts on each side of the foam. And then I pull my foam off the hook point, and it sometimes gets stuck on the barb. So I pull it forward and sweep those fibers back. And then pulling forward on the foam, I reach in with my material hand and hold it around the hook shank and the dub body and take a couple of loose wraps. And then I take a couple of tighter wraps to bind it down. And this forms the first segment of our body, the carapace of the crawfish. And then I advance my thread forward and just spiral wraps forward to halfway between my first tie-in point and the barbell eyes. And then I pull that foam forward and once again hold it and take a couple of loose wraps again and try to keep it on top of the hook. Take a couple of loose wraps, then a couple of tighter wraps and bind it down, and then move my thread to just behind the eyes. Pulling forward on the foam, we form our third segment of the body by just taking, again, just as before, a couple of loose wraps and then a couple of tighter wraps. And then I pull my foam back and advance my thread in front of the eye and let it hang there. Now at this point, I take my scissors and right about even with the hook eye, I make a small hole in my foam. And then I stretch the foam and push that hole over the hook eye. And holding the foam forward, I take a couple of loose wraps, and this forms that fourth and final segment of the body of our crawfish. A few more wraps and then a few tighter ones to tighten it down, and it has a tendency to rotate here in the front, so straighten it out if it wants to twist around the body. Then I reach in with my scissors and trim the foam straight across just in front of the hook eye, and this forms the tail of the crawfish. And then I grab my whip finish tool, and we're almost finished, and give it a 4 or 5 turn whip finish. And then just for good measure, I'm going to give it another 3 or 4 turns here. And then trim off that tag end of our thread. And there's a nice tail of our crawfish. Now rotate the hook back, hook point down, and our final step is to trim our legs. So I'll pull those legs back, and I don't really stretch them. I just line up the tips and pull them back, and we want our legs fairly long. So I'm just going to trim just in front of my fingers there and trim the legs. And that finishes our maze full motion crawfish. And notice how the legs push out to the side just a bit, kind of like a skirt. And this is due to how we wrapped our rabbit. So this is the maze full motion crawfish. And if you have need of a crawfish pattern, I hope you'll give this one a try. It's a great looking fly.